Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Sejam todos bem-vindos à Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro e ao evento SP Mobile 2023, a quarta Escola de Ciências Avançadas e Mobilidade. Agradeço a todos pela presença. É uma honra termos vocês prestigiando esse evento. Assim como em suas 3 edições anteriores, 2017, 2019 e 2021, a SP Mobile 2023 tem por objetivo difundir a virada das mobilidades na teoria social, estimulando o debate teórico e metodológico na perspectiva das mobilidades. Esta quarta edição da Escola de Ciências Avançadas e Mobilidade iniciou na semana passada nas instalações da USP e do Sesc Pinheiros, na cidade de São Paulo. E nesses próximos 3 dias o evento ocorre aqui, nas instalações da UNIRIO. Vale ressaltar que o evento está sendo transmitido online pelo canal do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Memória Social da UNIRIO. A SP Mobile 2023 é uma realização conjunta dos docentes do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Turismo da Escola de Artes e Ciências e Humanidades, da Universidade de São Paulo, a USP, e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Memória Social da UNIRIO. O evento conta com o apoio da Fundação Carlos Chagas Filho de Amparo à Pesquisa do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, a FAPERJ, e da Coordenação de Aperfeiçoamento do Pessoal de Nível Superior, a CAPES. A organização desse evento é realizada pelo Laboratório de Eventos em Turismo, o Abertura, e pelos alunos da disciplina Turismo e Produção de Eventos, do curso de Bacharelado em Turismo, que é ministrado pela professora Joyce Lavandowski. Eu sou um dos alunos dessa disciplina, me chamo Pedro Rabric e estarei conduzindo esse evento como mestre de cerimônia. A partir do par Memórias e Futuros, a SP Mobile 2023 convida a refletir sobre os fluxos, os fixos e as fricções sobre as mobilidades socioespaciais e suas dinâmicas de presença e ausência, de proximidade e distância no cruzamento com múltiplas escalas de tempo. Na programação do evento, envolve diversas atividades realizadas hoje, amanhã e quarta-feira. Conferências, mesa livre docências, ateliê de pesquisa, lançamento de livro e, por fim, um tour pela favela da Rocinha encerra a programação desse evento. Hoje de manhã, a programação envolve uma mesa de boas-vindas e a apresentação da SP Mobile 2023, com a participação dos idealizadores deste evento. Em seguida, teremos uma conferência internacional sobre o futuro das mobilidades turísticas. Ao final da conferência, teremos um momento para debate entre os palestrantes e o público presente. À tarde, teremos a mesa virada das mobilidades e estudos urbanos. Ao final da mesa, teremos novamente um momento para debate entre os palestrantes e o público presente. Agora, daremos início à mesa de boas-vindas, onde teremos a participação dos idealizadores deste evento. Para que seja iniciada a mesa, convido para subir ao palco a coordenadora do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Memória Social, a professora doutora Camila Maria dos Santos Moraes. Convidamos também à mesa o professor doutor Tiago Alis, professor livre-docente da Escola de Artes, Ciências e Humanidades da USP. Agora, convidamos para compor a mesa de honra a professora doutora Bianca Freire Medeiros, professora livre-docente do Departamento de Sociologia e aos programas de pós-graduação em Sociologia e em Turismo da USP. Convidamos também o professor João Freitas, que é pós-doutorado no programa de pós-graduação em Memória Social da UNIRIO. Nesse momento, ofereço a palavra à coordenadora desse evento, a professora doutora Camila Moraes, para que possa dar continuidade.
Obrigada, Pedro. Obrigada, Pedro. Obrigada, Joyce, todos os estudantes, todas, todos e todes. Gente, bom dia, sejam bem-vindas, para facilitar e agilizar. Desculpa pelos problemas técnicos e o atraso agora no início, mas conseguimos contornar tudo. Bom, acho que Pedro já adiantou, antecipou tudo, né? Mas já nos poupou trabalho e tempo aqui. Mas, bom, essa é a primeira vez que esse evento está sendo realizado na UNIRIO, né? A escola é uma escola que foi pensada pela Bianca e pelo Tiago na USP, né? A primeira edição foi em 2017, contou com alguns participantes como o Dan, que está hoje aqui e vai fazer uma fala amanhã, Maria Alice, e vários outros, né, pesquisadores da área de mobilidades, né, tanto do Brasil, da América Latina, quanto do Norte, mais global, enfim. E aí a ideia a gente traz esse evento junto para a UNIRIO dentro de um programa de desenvolvimento estratégico da CAPES para o programa de memória social, que o João é pós-doutorando, inclusive, né, está como pós-doutorando justamente nesse programa. E a ideia é justamente trazer o debate das mobilidades para diálogo com a memória social, que é um programa da área interdisciplinar. E a memória, a gente entende que as mobilidades também são, né, interdisciplinares, e aí é uma conversa que nós achamos que pode ser profícua, né, para o programa de pós, enfim. E para a graduação em turismo, né, que é onde eu dou aula, é da onde eu venho, enfim. Né, essa aproximação com a graduação a gente também acha fundamental. Gente, minha fala é essa. Vou passar para o João, depois para a Bianca e Thiago. Pode ser? Obrigada, gente.
Não serei redundante ao que a Camila incluiu e tampouco vou me adiantar às falas de Bianca e Thiago, mas eu queria só frisar o quão é bacana a gente ver alunos tão empenhados em fazer isso acontecer e estarem aqui também participando do evento. Então, agradeço também a professora Joyce pela organização e a coordenação desses alunos. Fico muito contente de estar aqui nessa mesa com vocês e espero que a gente tenha um ótimo evento.
Bem-vindos, bom dia. Que maravilha ter vocês, né? Que bom, que bom. A gente teve dias muito intensos e emocionantes, produtivos do ponto de vista intelectual, mas também muito felizes do ponto de vista dos afetos. Então, eu tenho certeza que a gente vai replicar isso aqui, já estamos, né? E eu não vou falar mais não para a gente falar à tarde. Então, só tenho a agradecer.
Bom dia para todo mundo que vem aqui hoje conversar, refletir, conhecer pessoas, seguir nesses afetos, nesses conhecimentos, nesses encontros de sotaques, finalmente. A gente conseguiu fazer essa expansão nacional da SPMob, né? A gente estava até brincando que era Rock in Rio Lisboa, né? SPMob Rio. E a ideia é essa mesmo, assim, a gente ir a partir de algumas iniciativas que começam há alguns anos, seguir expandindo a reflexão, os debates, as perguntas, experimentando métodos, conhecendo mais gente, aumentando esse grupo de pessoas interessadas em olhar, pensar as mobilidades da forma tão entusiasmante que a gente tem tentado fazer com as pessoas que nos inspiram e com as pessoas com quem a gente divide espaço nos últimos tempos, né? Agradeço muito Camila, Joyce e todas as colegas aqui da UNIRIO por toparem receber essa escola dobrada esse ano, né? A gente sabe que é trabalhoso organizar eventos. Agradeço então especialmente aos alunos, às alunas, aos alunos. Queria sugerir que vocês também, se puderem, tomem notas. Assim, eu sei que vocês estão com funções várias aí, mas aproveitem para escutar, conversar, conhecer as pessoas, porque é realmente um momento muito especial para os estudos de mobilidades, que são, como somos de turismo também, né, bastante relevantes para os estudos de turismo. Então, muito obrigado. Aproveitemos muito esse espaço e vamos em frente. Obrigado, gente.
Gente, só agradecer, assim, eu esqueci de falar, né, mas em nome de alguns professores e colegas presentes, né, então, Frank, professor do turismo da UERJ, Maria Alice, professora da ECO, a Bruna do meu departamento, que está de licença, pós-doc, está aqui hoje, Thiago Juliano, né, recém-passado, Dan, professor da UNIRIO, que está como pós-doc aqui também na UNIRIO, fico no registro dos professores. Mas Dan eu já falei mais cedo, que Dan é nosso palestrante. Mas agradecer Dan e Jennie pela presença e pela contribuição com a escola esse ano. Obrigada.
Bom, primeiramente quero agradecer a presença dos professores na mesa de honra, assim como as boas-vindas e a apresentação da SPMob 2023. Agora, por favor, podem retornar à plateia. Antes de dar continuidade ao evento, informamos que esse evento confere certificado de participação. O certificado será disponibilizado na plataforma Eventtree e o link será enviado por e-mail para todos os presentes. O participante poderá fazer download do certificado gratuitamente. Lembramos que na quarta-feira, pela manhã, teremos o Tour pela Favela da Rocinha, encerrando a programação deste evento. O Tour Rocinha Histórica será conduzido por Antônio Carlos Firmino, fundador do Museu São Cofa, Memória e História da Rocinha. O ponto de encontro será a saída A da estação de metrô de São Conrado. Subiremos de van para a parte mais alta da Rocinha e cada pessoa custará sua passagem na van no valor de até R$ 5,00 e desceremos andando. Uma informação importante sobre o tour. Todos que desejarem realizá-lo precisam se inscrever nessa atividade, na plataforma do evento Eventtree. A inscrição também pode ser feita na secretaria do evento, na antessala deste auditório. Agora, dando continuidade às atividades da SP Mob 2023, iniciaremos agora a Conferência de Abertura, On the Horizon, Tourism Unfinished Futures. Após a conferência, teremos um momento para debate com perguntas da plateia, com a mediação dos professores Camila, Moraes e João Freitas. Convidamos a professora doutora, Jennie, Germann, Molz, para subir ao palco para a conferência de abertura. Jennie, we invite you to the stage, please. Jennie possui PhD em Sociologia e pós-doutorado no Centro de Pesquisa de Mobilidades, ambos pela Universidade de Lancaster, na Inglaterra. É professora de Sociologia no College of the Holy Cross. Seus interesses de pesquisa incluem mobilidades turísticas, tecnologias móveis, famílias móveis e viagens educacionais, hospitalidade e ética, cidadania global, lar e pertencimento, alimentação, consumo, identidade e metodologias móveis. Ela é coeditora da revista Hospitality and Society e sua publicação mais recente é The World is Our Classroom, Extreme Parenting and the Rise of World Schooling. Jennie, now it's your turn.
Thank you, Pedro, for that lovely introduction. And I'll just start with a whole bunch of thank yous. Thank you to Professor João, Bianca, Camila, Tiago for inviting me to join you for SP Mob and for making this such an amazing visit, unforgettable, completely unforgettable. Thank you to all of the students who have welcomed me so warmly. I always say tourism students are the best. The warmest, the friendliest, and I just love meeting you all. And thank you to everyone who I know is working behind the scenes to make an event like this come off, and it's just been really amazing and impressive every day of the event so far. So I hope I can rise to the occasion and meet you here. So many, many thanks. I want to start by just saying a word about my opening image here. So I've told some of you this, but I'm from the United States, and there I live in two different places. I work in Massachusetts, which is on the East Coast, but my family and my family life is in New Mexico, which is in the southwest of the United States. And this is an image from a town called Española, which is it's about an hour from where I live. And I thought I would impress you with a beautiful sunset. And then yesterday I realized, oh yeah, they have their own very beautiful sunsets. So, but anyway, I did my best. Okay, so, I also want to acknowledge that I know you've been having your June parties lately. So today in the United States is a national holiday, a new holiday for Juneteenth. It marks June 19th, 1865, when General Gordon Granger of Texas declared the freedom of enslaved peoples. And so now the United States is celebrating this freedom. Although I think it's important to acknowledge that what followed has actually been a period of unfreedoms for many people. So we celebrate and we still have a lot to do. And that's kind of the theme, I think, of this idea of tourism's unfinished futures. And I open as well with a quote from John Urry, about time. He says, "Time involves the permeation of the supposedly separate moments of past, present, and future. Each flows into the other as the past and future are created in the present." Okay, so what I want to do this morning is sketch out some broad themes around the title of the conference, Memórias y Futuros, and maybe just throw out some ideas that you can grab onto and maybe refer back to as we continue our conversations about this topic. Okay, are we ready to start? Yeah? Okay. So at first glance, we might be tempted to say that the tourism industry has tended to focus more on memories. For example, tourism is often organized around heritage-scapes, individual and collective remembering and reliving and reenacting historical events, or maybe collecting souvenirs and memories. And then mobilities studies, which is my background in my field of research, has tended to focus a bit more on the future. For example, the event that began the Center for Mobilities Research was titled Alternative Mobility Futures, and that has kind of been a theme that has shaped the field ever since. And we can see this in the trend, in the progression of John Urry's work, where in the first editions of his book, The Tourist Gaze, he had chapters on gazing at history, but then later, as he was developing his ideas around the mobilities paradigm, he changed that and instead added a chapter called Risks and Futures. So he was beginning to think about the future more. Of course, this is an overgeneralization. But as the call for this conference astutely observed, there hasn't been a lot of dialogue between mobility studies and memory studies. So I propose that we consider this theme of memories and futures not in terms of a distinction between mobilities and memories, but rather at the intersection of tourism mobilities, where neither memories nor futures sit still, and where the boundaries between past, present, and future are blurred. So, as the call for the conference puts it, the fixity of memory is always relative, always a process of permanent reconstruction. And the same is true of the future. That's why I want to propose the metaphor of the horizon, a line that shifts and moves with us rather than a predetermined chronological timeline that we are moving along, for thinking about the way tourism mobilities, memories, and futures are all co-constituted. Okay, that's where I want to be. Jürgen Ole Barenholt and his co-authors write, individually and together, tourists are caught up in the project of creating future memories as tourism mobilities circulate through the dreamscapes of anticipation and remembrance. And John Urry writes, travel is thus more generally about multiple anticipations, like what's going to happen, and memories, thinking about what did happen, of people and places. So I think that if we think about tourism mobilities and we think about quotes like this, what they're really asking us to consider are the multiple and complex temporalities of tourism, including how those temporalities are intertwined with questions of justice. And here I'm drawing on the work of Mimi Scheller and her book on mobility justice. In fact, this is kind of the overarching aim of my talk this morning, is to consider tourism mobilities as complex assemblages of memories and anticipation, of times, tempo, and temporality, and of power structures that unevenly distribute mobility, but also hope. And so from this perspective, I'm going to reflect on 3 horizons in my own work, and in other scholars' work on tourism mobilities and mobile lifestyles, the politics of pace, performing futures, and then unfinishedness. I don't know if everyone can see the quote, so I'll read it. The first one is from John Urry. The future increasingly seems to dissolve into an extended present. And then the second one is from my yoga instructor, Nancy. The slower you go, the more you feel. The faster you go, the more you do. So the first thing that comes to mind when I think about memories and futures in conjunction with tourism mobilities is the fact that tourism is not just a spatial practice, but a temporal one. It seems obvious to say that mobility is the movement across space over time, but it's another thing altogether to examine how tourism mobilities both create and emerge out of complex spatiotemporal choreographies of place and pace. So tourism scholars have addressed this interplay between time and space in a number of ways. On the more quantitative end of the spectrum, researchers have charted tourist movements by graphing time geographies or having tourists like fill out time diaries, like what did you do for how many hours and where did you do it. And on the qualitative side, they've written a little bit more philosophically about tourism as a liminal time out of time, or as travel back in time, or kind of this psychoanalytical idea that tourists are regressing back to their own childhood, so going back in time. I tend to be more on the qualitative side of things, by the way. And tourism geographers like Tim Edensor, among others, have turned to the work of Henri Lefebvre to conceptualize the spatio-temporal nature of place. Lefebvre encourages us to think in terms of a localized time, or if one prefers, a temporalized space. So you can see that he's getting at this idea that time and space are always intertwined. And based on that, Lefebvre then recommends a method called rhythm analysis. And I know a lot of you are really interested in methods and questions of methods, and I think this is a pretty interesting one to apply. And Tim Edensor uses it in his work. He has a book on geographies of rhythm, and he has studied tourism and walking in the city, where he describes the polyrhythmic ensemble of tourists, commuters, and school children. I was just hearing about the polyrhythmic ensemble of commuting to school, which sounds pretty hectic, actually. You know, buses, trams, cars, people, bodies, young bodies, old bodies, right? All kind of trying to get where they're going. And then in another study, he highlights the discordant rhythms of a tourist coach excursion. So what it feels like to be a tourist on a bus traveling through a landscape where there's this juxtaposition of the buses, like cushioned, gentle motion with sudden acceleration and braking, with hungry and tired bodies that need to eat or stretch. So from a rhythm analysis perspective, time does not unfold like a ticking clock, right, moving from the past to the present, but rather as a relational, embodied, affective, like emotional, and multi-sensuous way of inhabiting the world while on the move. So rhythm analysis is one way of exploring how bodies, places, emotions, movements, and temporality are intertwined. And one of the things that I want to think about more in my own work is the emotional politics of pace. And this is a theme that I've started to explore with a colleague of mine, Dorina Maria Buda, in our work on emotion and affect in tourism. But I haven't done it yet, so I can't talk about it yet, so we're going to talk about something I have written about instead. So, and that is pace myths. So for now, I just want to mention this other concept for critically mapping the spatiotemporality of tourism mobilities. And this is what I call pace myths. And this concept is inspired by Rob Shields' work on place myths, this notion that there are these dominant narratives that circulate about the unique qualities of a particular place based on their scenery, their history, their culture. I think a great example of this, of course, is the idea of the traveling favela, which is a very powerful place myth about Rio. And I argue that these narratives are also tapping into the temporal regimes associated with a particular place. And that's what I mean by pace myths. So for example, Tokyo is portrayed as like fast and hectic. Dubai or Neom in Saudi Arabia. I've just heard about this new thing. I don't know if y'all are familiar with it, this planned city in Saudi Arabia. If you're interested in urban studies, this is kind of an interesting one. These are known as like these fast-paced cities of the future. A place like, oops, I went too far. Oh, I think I lost a slide. Oh, I mixed up my slides, okay. A place like Bali is sort of, the pace myth about Bali is that it's slow and serene, or other places are historical or a step back in time. And as pace myths circulate, they conflate places with particular historical periods or temporal rhythms. So maybe a beach destination has like a more elastic tempo than an urban center, and there's these ideas about island time or beach time. I understand in Rio we don't have to be quite so like punctual, right? Because there's like this temporal regime here. Where I live in New Mexico, we have something called Taos time. Taos is the name of the town, and we say Taos time, which means it's going to happen tomorrow. But it also means if you want to get any bureaucratic task done, it's going to take Taos time, which is forever, like, right? So there are like these temporalities that are associated with particular places. And these are obviously, they're stereotypes that are perpetuated by powerful media and marketing machines. But these pace myths are really part of how certain places get constructed or get performed as rural or urban, as central or peripheral, as oriented forward or backward in time. And this is how we're able to think of some places as like repositories or like conserving individual, collective, or national memory. So the designation of some places as heritage-scapes or sites of remembrance, for example, it doesn't just occur naturally because something important happened there, but it has to be constantly reproduced in the collective present and as a form of future memory. Okay, so, apologies, I mixed up my slides, but this is where I want to be now. So these places and the pace of people's mobilities within them map onto a moral geometry that codes slowness along the axes of gender, race, class, and nationality. So anthropologist Philip Vanini says that, quote, "To travel slowly is a necessity for some people in some circumstances, but it is also a choice for other people in other circumstances." So you begin to see the politics around pace. For example, we're more likely to ascribe value to like a relatively wealthy tourist who's like, oh, I'm gonna go on a sustainable, slow travel trip that for other people, for poorer travelers, is just like a fact of life, that they have to travel slowly because they can't afford to travel fast. And Antiguan writer Jamaica Kincaid sharpens the point when she writes about the way wealthy white tourists from abroad mistake the Antiguan natives' quote, life of overwhelming and crushing banality and boredom for the charm of an unhurried lifestyle. So Pacemiths, especially those that represent or maybe romanticize places as inherently slow, tend to overlook the way these places and their residents are embedded in like these broader spatiotemporal constellations. So in part this is because like in Antigua it feels slower in relation to maybe the fast urban centers that the tourists are coming from, but also to the extent that a slower pace of life in a place like Taos or Antigua can be traced back to legacies of economic subjugation or colonial extraction, or in places like New Orleans or Haiti, where the devastation of acute disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions is exacerbated by the slow violence and slow disasters of colonialism, slavery, and genocide of indigenous peoples, as Mimi Scheller describes in her book, Island Futures, or to the symbolic violence of what Ghassan Hage, an Australian anthropologist, calls stuckedness. So stuckedness is when you're stuck and you have no control over being stuck. And this often follows in disasters. And by the same token, discourses about speedy recoveries or bouncing back commit their own kind of violence. So what I want to sort of emphasize is that Pacemiths are, they're like temporal stereotypes about places, but they're not innocent ways of imagining or marketing destinations. Memories of these violent and painful histories are often erased or depoliticized in the romanticized marketing of like, oh, we're just downshifting into a slower way of life. And I'm citing here from Freire Medeiros and Name's article about the cable car favela article. They say that we have to acknowledge the certainty that almost everything which is presented as new has a long-term, conflictive, and oftentimes colonial genealogy. And so they encourage us to take a decolonial approach to, quote, better understand the spatiality and historicity of mobility patterns that are still characteristic of post-colonial metropoles, such as Rio de Janeiro, whose identity has been built on the interconnection between imagery of modernity, colonization, and coloniality, right? So here we have past, present, future. We have to kind of have this multi-scalar in a temporal, like multi-temporal perspective. In addition, we might also understand how the pace of life in places like Rio or other tourism destinations is marketed or valued or devalued in relation to Eurocentric colonial notions about speed, progress, or linear time. Okay, so this brings me back to the place where memories and futures intersect with mobility justice. And I follow Tim Cresswell, another geographer, Tim Cresswell's claim that, quote, speeds, slownesses, and immobilities are all interrelated in ways that are thoroughly infused with power, right? So pace is about power. And as we know, mobility justice, as Mimi Scheller describes it, is not just about who moves and who doesn't move, but it's also about the way mobility resources are distributed and how the capacity for movement is distributed unevenly and unfairly privatized, but also how it could be potentially more equitably allocated as a common good. So thinking about mobility justice requires us to pay attention to the uneven distribution of pace as well as mobility, including the risks and the pleasures that come along with traveling slowly or traveling quickly. So this brings up all these questions for me, like why is it that when some people move more slowly, their mobility is read as like deficient or illegitimate or even criminal, whereas other people's slow travel is deemed to be like, oh, you're like on a transformative trip, or you're doing something good for the planet. So beyond like the physics of fast and slow movement, I think we need to be attuned to the way we value pace. Why do we perceive some places as like harbingers of an ever faster future? Why are some places praised for preserving history, but others are kind of accused of being stuck in the past? So, okay, so I'll just leave you with those questions. All right, let's go on to the next theme then, which is this idea about performing futures. John Urry writes, "Futures are now everywhere." So these associations, right, this idea that Dubai is in the future and that, you know, Bali is a slow place, these are not natural or inevitable, but they are an effect of the way tourism mobilities perform memories and futures. So I think it's like pretty easy to think about how tourists perform the past, and maybe some of you are doing this research on like heritage scapes and stuff. I think we can think of examples of tourist places that are designed for individual or collective performances of memory. These can include heritage sites, commemorative sites like the 9/11 Memorial in New York City, living history museums like Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, where visitors can, mostly school children, they go there on field trips. They can try their hand at the day-to-day tasks of everyday life from the 1830s in New England. There are these like eerily preserved places like Chernobyl or Pompeii, where we're really fascinated by something being like frozen in time. There are the performances of Afro-Brazilian cultural heritage in Bahia, or former war sites in the United States where people, and in Europe too, I think, where people like to go and dress up like soldiers and reenact famous battles. So these are just some examples off the top of my head. I'm sure you can imagine like a million examples, right, of how tourists perform the past. And then I was like, okay, so then how do tourists perform the future? And that was a little bit more difficult for me to think about, because there's sort of less attention on this idea that tourism is performing the future. But I did think of a few examples. I thought about Disney World. Disney World is like this iconic example of everything, right? But Walt Disney wrote that Disneyland will be the essence of America as we know it, the nostalgia of the past with exciting glimpses into the future. And so Disney has this exhibit called Tomorrowland, and with Space Mountain, and this thing over here on your left is called the Carousel of Progress, and it was an exhibit people could go and like see what the future was going to look like. And I just discovered that Rio has a museum of tomorrow, so I think I have to go visit that as well. But Disney, I don't know about the Museum of Tomorrow, but Disney is really like, it's like a museum of the vintage future, right? The future we thought we were going to have, with all these shiny appliances and monorails and space travel. I also thought about, I brought this up the other day, this idea of last chance tourism, which is this desire to travel to places or to gaze on wildlife and natural landscapes that are likely to disappear as the planet warms and sea levels rise. So this could be another example of how tourism performs the future, or maybe accelerates us toward that kind of apocalyptic future. I think where futures are very often performed in tourism isn't necessarily in tourism itself, but in tourism studies. And here the future is performed in a couple of ways. There are like scenarios of actually lived tourism futures, and then also as a metaphor in terms of how people imagine or desire or travel according to a particular future imaginary. So since 2015, we've had the Journal of Tourism Futures, and you can see, if you can see it, you can see the cover shows a guy kind of staring off into the horizon, waiting to see what the future is going to bring him. And during COVID-19, a lot of scholars took the pandemic as a moment to kind of think about the unlivable future of global warming and wealth disparities and environmental and humanitarian disasters that are in store for us if we don't kind of change our path toward capitalist expansion and extraction. And there was a really nice special issue of Tourism Geographies that I can recommend to you on these topics. So there are these like broad overlaps between tourism studies and mobility studies, with future scenarios showing up, like in a lot of John Urry's later work. One of the last books he published was called What is the Future? And he has like these dystopian scenarios of hypermobility, where we've run out of resources like water and oil and energy, and so how will we travel in that future? And it reminds me of like Mad Max, right, where we're out there like fighting for a little drop of oil to run our tractor or whatever we're driving around in the future. He also has some like more hopeful scenarios, although he says they're unlikely, and these are where our future is we're much more local, we're not traveling very far. Future scenarios also show up in Mimi Scheller's work on mobility justice, where she sketches out an agenda for researching, designing, and advocating for alternative mobility futures, including tourism futures, that channel the power of mobility toward more collective, just, and regenerative modes. And at the same time, tourism scholars have tried to envision the kinds of happy futures we might enjoy if we put these lessons into practice. So if we learn the lessons of sustainable and regenerative development, economic diversification, indigenous knowledges, and decolonial thought. And so a really beautiful example of this that I've been looking at recently is by some scholars and activists in Hawaii who have been creating and sort of living into scenarios of decolonial tourism futures. This book is edited by Hokulani Akau and Bernadette Vicuña Gonzalez, and it's called Detours, A Decolonial Guide to Hawaii. And I think this is really important and necessary work, but in my own work, I've tended to engage with the future from a slightly different angle. So I've been more interested in how the future works as a metaphor, especially in the mobility performances of privileged middle-class tourists and travelers. So many of these travelers that I study bring with them a colonial mindset, and the future figures for them as a source of like anxiety, but also something they have to prepare for. And this shapes their motivations and their behaviors. So this is how the future kind of looms in my book, The World is Our Classroom. So this was an ethnography that I did of world schooling families. World schooling families are predominantly white, middle class. They're mostly from North America, Western Europe, a few from Australia, New Zealand. So you're beginning to get the picture, right? They have a lot of economic resources, a lot of technological resources. And they are unhappy with the schooling systems where they are, so they take their children out of school and they teach them while traveling the world. And the idea is that the world is their classroom. And they're not strictly tourists, although they do a lot of touristy things. It's more like a mobile lifestyle. And when I started doing the research, I was interested in sort of how these world schooling families were untethering what we might think of as family life, right? So they're not living in a home, they're not going to school or to an office, they're not having family life in a neighborhood or in their like backyard. But as I got into the ethnography, what I realized was that this lifestyle was really about the future and the way they were imagining the future. And so for these families, they were imagining the future as very uncertain. They were very worried about their children's prospects for future careers or for being successful in the future or for holding on to their middle class status in a world that is just so, with so much precarity around labor conditions, economic conditions, and geopolitical conditions. And so a lot of the impulse in the way they were teaching their children was to equip them with the skills they would need to kind of thrive in this uncertain future that the parents were imagining. So they were trying to teach them to be adaptable. They were trying to teach them to be entrepreneurial, right? To kind of like be self-reliant, to be able to handle cultural differences very easily. And they were really trying to, what I say in the book, they were trying to future-proof their kids. So the future was an orienting metaphor in their mobile lives. It was both this unstoppable force that they needed to like brace themselves for and prepare their kids for, but they also saw the future as like something they could design. So if they could just create the proper lifestyle for themselves and their kids, they could sort of control what was really an uncontrollable future. And I say that these strategies are about performing the future in particular ways because their solutions for coping with future uncertainty perform the future as uncertain and competitive, and therefore it requires these personal tactics of lifestyle design, right? Like personal solutions rather than collective action. It was more about guaranteeing their own kids' advantage in a risky future than about making the world a little more stable for everyone. So to me, this is a really different kind of future than like what Eichau and Gonzalez and their collaborators are imagining in decolonial futures, right? So we have all these people who are on the move in all these different ways, according to whatever sort of metaphor of the future is guiding them. Okay, I got a little off track here, but we'll come back. So to make sense of the way that this metaphor of the future was working in the world schoolers' stories, I turned to anthropologist, oh, there's my book. Sorry, I missed a slide. Okay, that's it. Oh, and this is just like a shot from one of the world schoolers' websites. And you can see here they're talking about how world-schooled children are more exposed to practical life skills, and learning is increased when the outcomes are tangible. They're capable of making informed choices. They learn how to budget, how to navigate local markets, cook their own meals. But more importantly, they say it's not about standardized tests, rote memorization, or comparison to peers, because these things are not good indications of future success. Instead, they're like trying to teach them how to be self-reliant and teaching them how to live in a mobile world as well, right? Equipping them with a lot of mobility resources. But thankfully, Arjuna Appadurai gave me a way to think about this. So Appadurai's book is The Future as Cultural Fact. And he rejects this idea that risk is the only or even the primary prism through which we can imagine future ways of life. Sometimes we get so stuck in thinking that the future is risky that we can't imagine any other possibility. Instead of succumbing to the risk society's numerical logic in which everything is calculated in terms of an ethics of probability, Appadurai proposes an ethics of possibility, one that offers, quote, a more inclusive platform for improving the planetary quality of life and can accommodate a plurality of visions of the good life. So rather than focusing on protecting ourselves from the future or from future harms, an ethics of possibility enables us to proactively envision what is desirable, what would we want, and what is good. And he calls this ability to imagine and to construct a good life and a good future the capacity to aspire, or the capacity to hope. But he also reminds us, much like mobility or pace, the capacity to hope is not equally distributed. So the ability to hope for and pursue the good life remains largely in the hands of a wealthy and privileged few, but our collective fortunes rest on our ability to expand the capacity to aspire to all people. And for Eichau and Gonzalez, the co-editors of Detours that I mentioned a minute ago, expanding the capacity to aspire, that's their starting point for performing decolonial tourism futures. So I guess the distinction here is that rather than starting by saying, this is what the future should look like, they're starting from the point of saying, hey, how do we create a world where everybody can participate in imagining a future good life? And so in their introduction, they're referring to another really famous decolonial thinker and activist whom you're probably familiar with, Franz Fanon, who charged Indigenous scholars to, quote, write about the past and present with the intention of opening up the future, of spurring them into action and fostering hope. Beyond writing about the future, Fanon also urged action, right? They quote him again, quote, in order to secure hope, in order to give it substance, we must take part in the action and commit our body and soul to the national struggle. When it comes to talking about that one thing in life that involves opening up new horizons, then muscle power is required. And the editors translate Fanon's mandate into the book's premise. If we are going to reshape the future, we must actively prepare now. And so they describe how the contributors to their book are leveraging that hope for the future, that capacity to aspire, into practices, imaginations, artistic installations, and stories that are putting, quote, putting decolonization into practice in their communities and places today. So this like precarious future that hovers over on the horizon for world schoolers, it shapes their global itineraries, their mobile practices, their entrepreneurial endeavors. A lot of them become digital nomads in a really particular way that I think is very different from a decolonial future of restored Indigenous sovereignty, which imagines a tourism future where maybe not every tourist is welcome in every place. And both of these examples suggest that we're not just projecting the future into some moment that's going to come eventually, but rather as a metaphor for the tourism mobilities that we perform today. Third theme, last theme, we're getting there. Are y'all still with me? Okay. Okay, so in 2013, I was a visiting Fulbright scholar at the University of Lapland in Rovaniemi, Finland. I was there to work with Soila Veola, who is a Finnish scholar. Maybe some of you are familiar with some of her work. She's known for her feminist theories on the body in tourism, hostessing, and tourism as work, and mobile neighboring. These are some of her big concepts. And at the time, she was playing around with these ideas about creativity and design in tourist dwelling. And she had this vision of bringing together a group of researchers, but she didn't want to have a conference. So instead, she brought us together and we camped together. So we were like sharing our dwelling space as we were sharing our research. We were all living in this little cabin up in the very, very north of Finland in the snow. And we were near a local ski resort, so we were in a tourist place. And we were living, working, eating, and playing together for a week. And during that week, we were also, we were experimenting with some of the notions that Soila was exploring around creativity. And in particular, she was interested in the way limits feed creativity. So we know that if everything is too regulated and there's no room to move around, there's no room for creativity, we understand that, right? But the opposite can also be true. If things are too free, too open, there's no traction for creativity. There's not enough friction to kind of get your brain working in a different way. So Soila wanted us to try this experiment. We worked very hard too. She was very strict with us. This tourist experiment in post-biopolitical dwelling. And what we did is we gave ourselves rules for our writing. So for example, one of the rules was that we had to engage in our writing with the work of at least 2 thinkers who were not in our own discipline. We had to choose thinkers who addressed the world from different positionalities, right? So if one of our thinkers was male, then another one had to be female or from different parts of the world or whatever. We were also supposed to take care of the reader's experience, so we weren't allowed to use any academic jargon. And we were also, another rule was that we had to position tourism not as an innocent bystander, but as an agent of change in the world. Okay, so these are the limits that were supposed to like drive our creativity. And I don't know how well we adhered to the rules. Like, I definitely used academic jargon in my chapter. But it was a pretty interesting writing experience, and it resulted in this book. So for my part, so the thinkers I chose, I broke the rule. I didn't just choose 2. I chose like 5. I was working with Plato and Heidegger, the philosophers, because they're not in my, well, Plato especially. And then I tried to critique their work by using feminist theorists like Elizabeth Gross and Betsy Waring. And then I also invited to my party the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paolo Ferrari. And in fact, it's Freire's idea about unfinishedness that I want to eventually get to here. And so for my book, for my chapter in the book, I chose the theme of camping, which I considered as a kind of praxis where ontologies of being and becoming intersect with actual embodied practices like pitching tents or kindling fires, and where tourism is not an innocent escape, but a creative and sometimes violent agent of world-making. And I also saw camping as a form of tourism that plays with unfinishedness. So unlike like when you show up at like an all-inclusive beach resort, it promises to fulfill every void in your life, right? It promises to feed you with 24-hour buffets with every kind of food you can imagine, with, you know, the most comfortable bed, with all of the amenities in the room that you could ever want, and with whatever sense of life purpose or fulfillment is missing, it's all gonna, like, you're gonna have all of it there. That's not how camping works. You know, if you've been, has anyone gone camping, like wild camping? Okay, well, there's no, yeah, there. It's more characterized by what's not available, by discomfort, by making do. And so I was thinking about camping as this ontological moment in which, like, the invented structures of social life are revealed as inventions. Right? They're not inevitable. And we can sort of have a minute to consider, like, what would it look like to live differently? So the story that I tell in this chapter, it's a combination of memories and futures. And so I start off by recalling my own family's summer camping adventure when I was a kid, and the way my sister and I would camp. I was telling some of you, I keep seeing these white VW combis, the vans. So my family had a van like this, only it was green. And we would put all the camping stuff in it and drive out into the woods. This was our vacation, because my mom was a teacher and my dad was a minister, so we couldn't afford, you know, to fly and stay at nice hotels. So we would go camping. And my sister and I, as soon as we would get there, we were like, okay, we have to make ourselves at home. So we would like sweep away everything. We would put up our tent, and then we would like say, okay, put my sleeping bag here, so this is my bedroom, and your sleeping bag there, so that's your bedroom. And then we would put like the camp stove out on the picnic table, and this is the kitchen. And then we would make take logs to make a little patio for a front door, right? So we would kind of like reconstruct home with whatever we could find in nature. And I look back on it and I think, wow, we really lacked imagination. Like, our very first impulse was to recreate the home we had just left. But it was fun to do it with whatever we could find around us. I'm not sure if my sister remembers those camping trips exactly the way I do. I doubt it. But some of our camping trip memories have gelled into like family lore as we tell and retell the stories. Especially the time when my dad accidentally caught himself on fire while lighting the camp stove, and my mom had to leave all us kids in the woods and drive him to the nearest hospital, which was like an hour away. And whenever my siblings and I get together, we retell this story as a form of collaborative memory, right? It's like a collaborative memory project that we do together. And the story is never the same, and it's never finished. Another story I tell in that chapter is about a camping trip oriented toward an unpredictable future. Back to this theme. This story focuses on a group of chefs. These are some really internationally famous chefs. Maybe you've heard of them, like René Redzepi and David Chang, who participated in a project called Cook It Raw. Cook It Raw. This was a so-called summer camp for culinary hotshots. And so these chefs, they're very famous. They work in these like restaurants where you have to get on the waiting list like a year in advance to go eat there. And they go out into the forest. They go away from their fully equipped kitchens with everything stocked. And they are challenged to create a cuisine only using low energy cooking techniques and only with food that they can forage, or native food or food that they can forage from the land. And the idea here is to experiment with ways of cooking and eating today that we may be forced into in a near future environmental apocalypse where food and energy become scarce. And so I suggest that Cook It Raw isn't about camping memories, but about camping as the future condition of human existence after environmental and social collapse. So the idea is that by learning, or in some cases relearning, because a lot of these cooking techniques aren't new, they're just going back to older or even indigenous knowledges about eating and cooking. But the idea is that by learning how to prepare like basic proteins and edible flora, we can start to adapt now to our hot new world. So the question that they ask on their website is, what if in 2050 jellyfishes and giant squids will be the only creatures left in the black polluted sea? Environmental issues like global warming are real and evolving. Now that the damage is done, it's time to think about adaptive strategies starting from what is on your plate. So I think in the future we're all going to just be eating eels or something, right? So they posted this to their website. When do you think? Yesterday? It was 12 years ago. 12 years ago they posted this in 2011. But this message of impending environmental collapse and this call for improvisational survival strategies feels both older and like really timely. So this future is both always already here. Like, for example, those places where energy and water and food are already scarce and Cook It Raw techniques have like been a daily necessity forever. And it's also always impending. It never actually quite arrives. So since 2011, since this was written, we've lived into and through a future of new geopolitical upheavals and wars, a global pandemic, the rise and fall of cryptocurrency, and the mass rollout of AI chatbots. And what this means for tourism, for the planet, for what is on our plate, is always an open question. So the future is here now, and yet it perpetually lingers on the horizon, always unfinished. And so this brings me back to the work of Paolo Ferrari and his concept of unfinishedness. For Ferrari, an educator, unfinishedness is an essential quality of the human condition in the sense that, quote, men and women are beings in the process of becoming unfinished, incomplete beings in and with a likewise unfinished reality. So our unfinishedness is what makes it possible for us to learn, to grow, to become. Ferrari writes that we are destined by our very incompleteness to seek completeness, to have a tomorrow that adds to our today. And for this reason, Ferrari presents unfinishedness as a source of hope, pushing us toward new horizons. He says, wherever there are men and women, there is always and inevitably something to be done, to be completed, to be taught, and to be learned, to become more. What does Ferrari's pedagogical concept of unfinishedness, though, tell us about tourism's tomorrow? I think we can think about this collection of terms, tourism, futures, memories, unfinishedness, from different perspectives. On the one hand, we might be inspired to think about tourism design and dwelling, beyond the all-inclusive resort or the luxurious hotel room that provides for the tourist's every whim, and instead maybe think about tourism dwelling or tourism design in terms of a campsite that offers like a few amenities, but lots of opportunities for arranging and inhabiting the space differently. On the other hand, we might think of future tourism development as an unfinished story that is always in the process of being told. So the answer to this, these seemingly unsolvable problems of today's unjust, extractive, exploitative arrangements of tourism isn't necessarily to pin down an equally inflexible future, even if we think it's a more sustainable one, but rather maybe to lean into that indeterminate space between here and a horizon as a space of possibility. So are there ways to design unfinishedness into our scenarios of a sustainable, happy, just, and decolonial future? Yay, I'm getting to the conclusion, I promise. Okay. So I've tried to sort of step back and put the themes of memories and futures into this larger ontological framework about the fundamentally spatio-temporal nature of tourism, and this idea that tourists and tourism are always in the process of becoming, that we're not necessarily moving in a straight line from the past to the present to the future, but in a relational state of constantly making and remaking the worlds that we visit, that we know, that we inhabit. And I've also tried to situate my discussion in a political and ethical framework by highlighting the way space and time and futures and memories are infused with questions of power. So for example, Pacemiths are about the way different, about Pacemiths and sort of the way we politicize speed or slowness, the way different people are performing different futures, which means they're moving in different ways today, and also then about the way pace feeds into a capacity to aspire. But so those comments were political, right? But when it comes to unfinishedness, I think this is an ethical question. To say that tourism's future is unfinished, I mean, maybe it seems like a way to dodge responsibility, right? To get out of having to come up with the answer. But I think it's actually the opposite, because it's only by leaving the future unfinished that we're able to be responsible beings. According to Paolo Ferrari, the ability to be ethical is tied up in our ability to be unethical. He says, as unfinished beings, conscious of our own unfinishedness, we are capable of options and decisions that may not be ethical. And the way I think about this is with my friend and colleague Emily Hockert, who is also one of the campers in Finland with me. She says something similar in relation to the ethics of hospitality. So in her book, Negotiating Hospitality, this was an ethnography she did in Nicaragua, tourism development projects in Nicaragua. And she says that when we talk about the ethics of hospitality, what we really need are moments of undecidability and unlearning. So if we have, we think about Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, writes about the law of hospitality, that you must accept or welcome the stranger. Whoever shows up at your door, you must welcome them no matter who they are. But when we have a law like that, we don't have to think for ourselves, right? That's the law. That's what we have to do. But if we leave it open and undecided, then for every moment in which we're faced with making this decision, we have to, as Hockert says, we have to negotiate it constantly. We have to come up with fresh decisions, and that's where our ethical engagement is happening. So rather than closing down options, either through Pacemiths that lock certain people and places in time, through narrow visions of what the future can be, or through architectural design that allows only one way to inhabit a dwelling or to live together, or through laws of hospitality that afford only one response, unfinishedness and undecidability remind us to embrace the beauty and the burden of an uncertain future. Thank you. I'm done now.
Jennie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It was such an honor. Agora, para a gente iniciar o debate e a mediação das perguntas, eu chamo para o palco os professores Camila Moraes e João Freitas.
Thank you, Jennie. It was amazing. Gente, bom dia. Vou passar a palavra para o João fazer alguns comentários, nos ajudar a entender a fala da Jennie, tirar o melhor proveito desse momento. E depois a gente vai abrir para as perguntas, tá? Oi? As perguntas, quem quiser fazer em português, pode fazer em português, a gente traduz aqui para ela. Quem quiser fazer diretamente para ela em inglês, também pode, também fique à vontade, tá bem? Mas qualquer coisa a gente ajuda, pode fazer em português e a gente traduz aqui para a Jennie. I'm saying that we can translate the questions also to you, or they can do it in English if they want. João? Você está pronto ou você quer que eu fale? Eu faço isso.
Jennie, thank you so much. Your talk was a breath of fresh air, and you deliver us a unique perspective on the topic. So thank you so much for this. And as previously discussed, I will provide my comments in Portuguese. I already gave you my comments in English. Following that, I will proceed with my questions in English, and we will also encourage the audience to contribute their own questions to the discussion. So thank you so much for this. Basicamente, estava dizendo que eu vou falar em português. Acho que isso é um momento importante também para a SPMOB, de marcar território, da gente conseguir fazer um diálogo amplo com outras línguas, mas sem abandonar o português. Eu estou tentando só colocar as imagens aqui em ordem para tentar dar um pouco de ilustração para o que eu vou falar, vou comentar em cima da fala da Jennie, mas eu queria primeiro agradecer a Bianca, Camila e Tiago, parceiros na organização da SPMOB desse ano, mas principalmente pela honra de estar aqui nessa mesa junto com a Jennie. E acho que a gente conseguiu dar início à agenda da SPMOB aqui no Rio em altíssimo nível. Conseguimos? Ótimo, me atende. Não preparei nada muito rebuscado, mas era somente para a gente ter uma ilustração, ter rosto, ter imagem. Acho que isso é importante. Acho que não teríamos lugar mais apropriado do que aqui para costurar um debate que envolve os temas da memória e também das chamadas mobilidades turísticas. Temos a presença de alunos e professores da graduação em turismo, bem como também o apoio fundamental do programa de pós-graduação em Memória Social aqui da UNIRIO. Eu, particularmente, Jennie, fiquei muito feliz em ver Paolo Ferrari sendo citado por você. Ao longo dos últimos 4 anos, além do rastro de morte e destruição, figuras como Paulo Freire tiveram sua memória e legado atacados. Estamos em um momento, felizmente, de inflexão da história brasileira, mas a gente tem muito ainda a fazer. Particularmente, creio que não há como nos engajarmos nessa reconstrução sozinhos. Precisamos ter conosco essas referências. Precisamos lustrar, polir, dar brilho a esses ícones e contar com a ajuda deles para que nos direcionem para um futuro mais próximo, mais próspero. Nesse sentido, eu vou comentar a palestra da Jennie, incluindo nesse debate 3 conceitos afro-brasileiros que contêm em sua essência a mobilidade. Eu gostaria de encorajar os meus colegas, pesquisadores do campo, a se debruçarem sobre eles, sobretudo ao estudarmos o paradigma das mobilidades em uma perspectiva decolonial. São eles o tempo espiralar, a encruzilhada e o voltejo. Se Jennie nos ajudou aqui hoje a ilustrar Paulo Freire, nessa minha fala eu buscarei ilustrar Leda Maria Martins, professora aposentada pelo FMG, pesquisadora, poeta e rainha do Congado. Eu adorei ouvir Jennie falar sobre o cruzamento das mobilidades do turismo, onde nem as memórias, nem os futuros ficam parados, e onde os fios do passado, presente e futuro se emaranham. A compreensão ocidental do tempo, muito do que a gente compartilha, tende a entender que o tempo é sucessivo, cumulativo, monótono. Passado e futuro ficam em lados completamente opostos e seguem se distanciando perpetuamente. Já nas tradições Banto e Yorubá, para citar apenas 2 de muitas da matriz africana, isso se explica um pouco melhor. Elas compreendem que o tempo se movimenta em uma espiral, em que passado, presente e futuro se enovelam, se enrolam como um novelo de lã. É justamente o que explica Leda Maria Martins no livro Performances do Tempo Espiralar. Não é que não existam as noções de passado e futuro, elas existem. Porém, as fronteiras entre elas são bem mais porosas do que as que comumente concebemos. Trata-se de uma temporalidade que se curva para frente e para trás. Me engasguei, gente. Ao redor e para cima. Em movimentos espirais que retêm o passado como presente, ou como Jennie propôs, presentifica o passado, para assim moldar o futuro. É importante frisar que isso que a gente faz aqui não é apenas uma abstração ou mera metáfora, ainda que as mobilidades muito se interessem por elas. É também um ato político. Desafiar a cronologia é parte de um esforço maior que busca romper hierarquias que tendem a colocar as epistemes eurocentradas em um lugar mais alto do que as outras, que busca negar procedimentos éticos e normativos que encenam estruturas verticais de poder e de valor, que aceitam e perpetuam a violência dos dispositivos institucionais. A fala de Jennie me instigou muito a pensar na minha própria pesquisa, que tenho a satisfação de poder desenvolver aqui no programa de Memória Social. Eu tenho olhado para a Feira das Iabás, um evento gratuito criado por Marquinhos de Oswaldo Cruz, há 15 anos, que ocorre mensalmente em Madureira, um dos berços do samba. Na Praça Paulo da Portela é montado um palco. No início da tarde, há uma roda de conversa, sempre com temas afro-orientados. Já passaram por lá a escritora Conceição Evaristo, a chefe Kátia Barbosa, e mais recentemente a jornalista Flávia Oliveira e a pesquisadora Eliana Teodoro. Todas essas citadas mulheres pretas, entre outras muitas. No final da tarde e ao longo da noite, há sempre uma atração musical. Por lá já passaram Leci Brandão, Alcione, Arlindo Cruz, Dona Ivone Lara, entre muitos outros. O que eu defendo aqui é que todos esses ícones precisam ser lustrados. Nosso futuro enquanto civilização depende de Dona Ivone Lara. Em Yorubá, a palavra Iabá significa mãe-rainha. É utilizada para se referir às orixás femininas. Na feira, as rainhas são as tias do samba, que vendem em suas barracas comidas que já ocupam um lugar especial no nosso imaginário. Tenho certeza que muitos de vocês já ouviram falar, ou talvez já tenham até experimentado a comida de tia Surica, ou mesmo conhecem o pagode do Vavá do Paulinho da Viola. Será? Provei do famoso feijão da Vicentina. Quem é da Portela é que sabe. Fiquei nervoso, gente. Eu tinha ensaiado, mas deixa pra lá. Mas só quem é... Basicamente só quem é da Portela sabe que a coisa é divina. E divina aqui no sentido não só de delicioso, mas divino realmente. O que eu quero defender, a partir da fala de Jennie, é que não existe... Foto do feijão. Não existe futuro sem ancestralidade. A ancestralidade é cortada por esse tempo curvo, recorrente, espiralar. Jennie, I have to tell you, she's wearing a Vasco da Gama jersey, just to make it easy. Simply the best soccer team in Brazil. Coincidentally, is the club that I support. Mas, enfim, a ancestralidade é cortada por esse tempo curvo, recorrente, um tempo espiralar que retorna, restabelece, mas principalmente transforma. É um tempo ontologicamente experimentado, com movimentos contínuos e simultâneos de retroação, prospecção e reversibilidades, dilatação, expansão e contenção, ação, contração e descontração. É feito pela sincronia de instâncias compostas de presente, de passado e de futuro. A praça Paulo da Portela, é entrecortada por duas ruas perpendiculares. É, portanto, uma encruzilhada. A encruzilhada é justamente o lugar em que não há fixidez. Para cá não tem nada de ancoradouros, não. Na concepção afro-brasileira, filosófica afro-brasileira, a encruzilhada é justamente o lugar das intermediações entre sistemas e instâncias de conhecimentos diversos. Uma trama colorida de ação, imaginação, compreensão e dispersão, interseções e desvios, fusões e rupturas, unidade e pluralidade. A encruzilhada é cartografia indispensável para a constituição epistemológica dos saberes afrodiaspóricos e, por consequente, dos saberes brasileiros. Além do movimento... Encruzilhadas, né? Eu estou um pouco atrasado aqui, gente, mas a gente vai se achando. Além do movimento performático dos corpos que cantam e sambam, a feira mobiliza coisas, ritmos, cheiros, sabores, signos, epistemes. Mas também complementa a renda das famílias cujas cozinheiras são as matriarcas, ou seja, movimentam até os alicerces dessa sociedade patriarcal. É naquele lugar, naquela encruzilhada, que enxergo o que a própria Leda Maria Martins chama de voltejos. Voltejo é o ato ou efeito de voltear. Se transitivo direto, é deslocar-se. Se intransitivo, é fazer algo girar. É basicamente o que Jennie e todos nós, pesquisadores das mobilidades, fazemos. Nos movemos com os objetos, ou fazemos que esses objetos estáticos se movam para o observarmos em outra perspectiva. Para Leda Maria Martins, o voltejo traz consigo o presente, o passado e as possibilidades de futuro, tudo em uma coisa só. É um respiro, um olhar renovado para o horizonte. Para ela, o voltejo é insurgente e revolucionário, porque todas as relações humanas, interpessoais, sociais, trabalhistas, adquirem nova perspectiva. O estudo das mobilidades podem e devem voltear os conhecimentos afrodiaspóricos. Talvez consigamos acionar novas concepções e até mesmo encontrar metáforas que não existem no repertório eurocêntrico. A Jennie, muito sagaz, percebeu que o tempo pode se reproduzir de formas não lineares, mas precisou suar a camisa hoje aqui para explicar isso. Nas culturas Banto e Yorubá, isso já era conhecido e tinha nome. Se para nós o movimento interessa, como objeto de pesquisa, para essas culturas o movimento é sagrado. E a pergunta é, onde entra o turismo nisso? Eu, particularmente, não estou preocupado em trazer nessa pesquisa compreensões mais ortodoxas sobre o turismo. Por um curto momento, eu até achei que seria interessante investigar os fluxos de pessoas vindo de outras zonas da cidade para visitar a feira, mas eu percebi que esse fluxo já existe, é bastante considerável. Eu atrasei completamente aqui, mas chegamos. A imagem era para ilustrar, mas ficou um pouco atrasada. Só uma imagem da feira. Existe esse fluxo na feira, mas a fala de Jennie aqui hoje sublinhou que tem algo um pouco mais urgente e que o olhar, as lentes das mobilidades podem enxergar com alguma precisão. Eu li o The Truth Gaze, a primeira versão mesmo, ainda na faculdade, com o incentivo do professor e hoje amigo Bernardo Sheibub. Temos, inclusive, uma orientanda dele aqui. E isso marcou de forma indelével o que eu entendo por turismo e, inclusive, me impulsionou a buscar trabalhar com Bianca Freire Medeiros, a quem muito devo. Logo, ainda que intuitivamente, o olhar do turista segue comigo. Nesse sentido, o que entra nessa minha lâmina de vidro, dessa pesquisa agora, é o que a Feira das Iabás movimenta. Mas também o que e como as pessoas ali olham a feira, gazing a feira, como a experimentam, como a performam. Mesmo para os que frequentam a feira todos os meses, essa é uma experiência que permanece ainda no campo do extraordinário. Jennie conseguiu aqui mostrar que, ao abraçar a ideia de inacabamento, conceito freiriano, e reconhecer que o futuro não é esse destino estável, mas um horizonte em constante expansão, nos abrimos para narrativas e possibilidades alternativas. O mote da SPMOB este ano é Memória e Futuros. Reparem, não é passado e futuros, é memória e futuros. É memória, pois se refere à nossa capacidade de se lembrar o que retemos, o que supomos e principalmente o que celebramos do nosso passado. Logo, o futuro aqui tampouco vai ser ciente e distante, senão a nossa própria capacidade de imaginá-lo e, por consequência, moldá-lo. Calma aí. Projetar inacabamento, o unfinishedness que Jennie trouxe nos cenários do turismo, envolve abraçar a flexibilidade, a adaptabilidade e a disposição para questionar e desafiar as estruturas e paradigmas existentes. Significa criar espaços para diálogo, colaboração e cocriação, onde múltiplas vozes e perspectivas sejam valorizadas e incluídas. Na busca por futuros sustentáveis, felizes, justos e, por que não, decoloniais, podemos buscar a transformação contínua e a aprendizagem constante. Em vez de buscar um plano final e fixo para o futuro do turismo, podemos abordá-lo como um processo em evolução, aberto à experimentação e também à inovação. Isso requer o envolvimento de diferentes atores, incluindo povos indígenas, comunidades locais e grupos marginalizados. novamente, é preciso ilustrar os ancestrais e valorizar os saberes e sabores. Por fim, o conceito de inacabamento, que a Jennie trouxe hoje para a gente, para nos provocar, imagino, nos convida a reimaginar e reinventar o turismo com uma prática dinâmica e inclusiva, constantemente moldada e remodelada pelas interações e aspirações de indivíduos e comunidades. Isso nos encoraja a abraçar a incerteza e navegar nas complexidades do presente, ao mesmo tempo em que moldamos ativamente o futuro almejado. E para terminar, o negócio amou, o resto é conversa fiada. Muito obrigado. Eu tenho uma pergunta também para a Jennie, para a gente continuar o debate. Jennie, I know that through the lens of mobilities, you have a keen eye for the infrastructures. So the Argentine writer Julio Cortázar, somewhere in his Libro de Manuel, says that a bridge is someone crossing a bridge. And you have definitely crossed that bridge today, so thank you so much. Last week on São Paulo, you noticed that we have a kind of fixation on methods, but strictly between us, I must admit that concepts also interest us greatly. In the field of mobility studies, there is a significant group of Brazilian scholars who are either training in the field or have tourism as their object of study. In this regard, we pay great attention on tourism mobilities. So actually, this is a question from our colleague, Juliana Carneiro. I would like to know, how do you perceive tourism mobilities? Is it a concept, a category, or a field, or perhaps all the three? Thank you so much.
Eu já vou passar para a Jennie responder essa pergunta.
Thank you, João. Wow, and thank you for this response and for bringing to life some of these ideas with your empirical data and these examples. Is like yeah, this is it. So, and thank you for this question. And one thing I'm learning about visiting you all is there are no easy questions. They're all very deep and very complicated. I think, I have to look at my notes here, but I think it is all three, right? I mean, when I think about tourism mobilities, I think about it both as an object of knowledge, like an empirical field, like an empirical context, and it's everywhere, all around us. I mean, even just yesterday, where we were going around in Rio, and I was taking pictures of all the tourists, because, you know, it is like, it's live, it's alive, it's happening. But it's also, I think, a lens, I guess. So in that sense, it's a concept. I'm not sure I would say that it's a category, because I get nervous every time we talk about categories, because categories, nothing ever actually fits the category. You know, they say, like, when you have a norm or an average, there's no actual person who is that average. So if you take an average height of everyone and someone is 1 meter and someone is 10 meters and the average is 5 meters, but there's no one who's actually 5 meters, right? So sometimes in that sense, I don't think about typologies or categories and more about like what's really happening in the world. But I do think it is both a way of looking at the world and a way of being in the world. And to me, that's what's really interesting about it too, is so, and to go back to the idea about methods, is that, I mean, we can see this is you making this video, or?
It's Instagram video.
Oh, okay, okay. But like, we're in it, right? We're there, and we are also the tourists. So it's, I would say it is a method, an object of inquiry, and a lens for looking at it. Is that okay? So thank you, and thank you to your colleague for the question too.
Bom, isso. Gente, temos perguntas da plateia? Não? Vocês? Desculpa, oi? Ah, tá. Bom, eu vou fazer uma pergunta então, já que ninguém a gente ainda tem um tempinho, vou fazer uma pergunta para a Jennie, vou fazer aqui em português e aí eu falo para ela aqui no pé do ouvido em inglês, mais fácil. Não vou me arriscar no inglês no microfone, não. Não, eu fiquei pensando sobre a questão do Paulo Freire, né? Gostei muito dela ter trazido o Paulo Freire e justamente a parte da liberdade, da pedagogia libertária, né? Para a gente pensar o turismo e esse turismo, né? Os futuros do turismo, enfim. Mas eu achei mais interessante pensar essa fala dela a partir do estudo dela sobre o mundo como uma sala de aula, né? Assim, né? Esse mundo que a gente pode descobrir através do turismo e das mobilidades, né? E aí, complementando até a resposta que ela deu, né? O que seriam essas mobilidades turísticas, né? Seria uma categoria, né? E aí o que ela fala é que é método, é lente, é objeto empírico, é uma forma de estar no mundo, é uma forma de ver o mundo, né? Então, na verdade, as mobilidades turísticas, né, não são exatamente uma categoria, né? Mas está muito relacionada a uma forma de olhar, né? Então, eu vou pedir para ela falar um pouco mais sobre isso na linha do Paulo Freire, assim, elaborando um pouco mais sobre o Paulo Freire nessa perspectiva né, uma das coisas que o Paulo Freire fala é que a gente aprende é exatamente isso, né? A gente aprende com a vida, né? A gente aprende experimentando, vivenciando, a gente aprende com a vida, não só em sala de aula, né? É o reconhecimento de que existe esse outro saber, né? E aí eu vou pedir para ela elaborar, falar um pouco mais sobre isso, dialogando, né, no diálogo do Paulo Freire com as mobilidades, né? Assim, pensando o turismo como uma ferramenta, ou as mobilidades turísticas como uma lente, enfim. Só para ela retomar esse ponto que eu acho que é interessante.
So Camila has told me her question about how we can dialogue with Paolo Freire's pedagogical work and my work in The World is Our Classroom. And in all honesty, I didn't actually really use Freire so much in The World is Our Classroom, but now I'm realizing I should have because it's very interesting. A lot of the families that I studied use a pedagogical approach called unschooling, UN, unschooling. And they follow pedagogical theorists like Holt and Illich, and even like Montessori, some of these educational theorists. And the idea is that when children encounter the world, their impulse is to learn. And so you don't need a lot of systems and structures in place for children to learn, because this is how they are. They are unfinished beings who are seeking completeness, to use Freire's words. And so a lot of the families just let their children set the agenda and decide what they want to learn. But this is very controversial because some of the kids just want to play video games all day, or they just want to play with Legos all day. And but I think that, I do think there is a lot of dialogue we can have between tourism studies and educational and pedagogical theories, because, I mean, in a way, this is also what tourists are doing. They want to learn about the world. Okay, maybe not like all of the tourists who are going on bachelor parties to Amsterdam. They want to do something else. But I do think that this is a big impulse. And, you know, Mimi had mentioned as well that in terms of thinking about mobility justice and who should be able to travel, and she said, oh no, you're awesome. Students should still be able to travel, right? Even if the kinetic elite and the mobile elite, we should travel less, and students should travel more, because their impulse in traveling is to learn and to create knowledge. So I'm not sure if that's the direction you thought I was going to go, but I don't know if that's helpful.
That's good. Yeah. Thank you. Gente, mais alguma pergunta? Pode fazer. Quer falar direto?
Oi, gente. Me chamo Ive, estou no primeiro período de turismo. Eu queria perguntar se a Jennie acha que só o estudo tipo, da vida é o bastante. Tipo isso, entendeu? Se esse estudo pelo mundo e sem um lugar concreto para você realmente estudar, ter uma linha de ensino, é o bastante para viver. Tipo isso. Isso, sem a vivência da sala de aula ou de uma universidade concreta.
Thank you, Evie. That's a really good question. This is part of the controversy about it, right? Because the families who are able to take their children out of formal schooling and travel the world are already privileged in a way that those mobilities enhance and create value for those children. Whereas children from less privileged backgrounds who don't get formal schooling and also travel the world, maybe children traveling in migrant families, or as refugees or as asylum seekers, they are also learning a lot, but their knowledge isn't celebrated in the same way that the knowledge being created by these middle-class white kids is celebrated. And so it is not for everyone, right? It's for like a very kind of elite privileged group who can turn their mobility into an asset. Yeah, it's a good question.
Hi, Jennie. Thanks for this fascinating presentation. Yeah, I'm going in kind of this way of this mediation between like experience in the world and how to transform these like this everyday knowledge of being in the world into something else or transformative, to put like in Paolo Ferrari's terms. And I was thinking when you were talking about, it drove me to the idea of imaginary geographies of Doreen Massey, about like how to imagine space could really take us to create different relations with people and, well, recognize them as people that their own trajectories. But I was thinking like, I always thinking about like these everyday ideas of knowledge and the transformative way of doing in the school, like teachers in universities. And I'd like to ask that, as in the tourism, how do you think that tourism could mediate like this everyday experience and like propose like different transformation of how we could see and could transform and order, imagine the world in another way, not just like being there. Thank you.
Thank you. I know I was going to say, there's just no easy questions here. Yeah, well, one of the things I mentioned when I was commenting on Mimi's talk in Sao Paulo was that John Urry had really encouraged mobility scholars, social science in particular, to get more involved in like this study of the future, future studies, and future scenario building. And I always remembered this thing we did in 2004 at the conference, the Alternative Mobilities Futures Conference, which was a long time ago, but I never forgot this. We did like a scenario project. And so one of the presenters came and we broke up into groups and they walked us through this sort of future scenario building. It was like a step-by-step process. And then at the end, each group presented their scenario of what they had come up with. And I remember my group wasn't very imaginative. We were like, oh, global warming is going to come and we're all going to die. It's like, right, we were very, very like cynical and dystopic. But some of the other groups just came up with these really crazy ideas about public transportation systems that we could have, or, you know, like ways of having communal living in the city. And I was so, my mind was opened by hearing other people's ideas. And so I think if maybe in tourism studies, if we could have more of this kind of creative pedagogy of not just teaching what is, but also teaching how to imagine what could be, because that's a skill, right? It's a skill to get out of your own head and your own narrow way of thinking. And maybe not just with students, but also with, you know, stakeholders in the community or tourists as well, right? To maybe do these kinds of future scenario building projects. Do you think that would work? Do you think that would be? Yeah, we can talk more, yeah.
Hi, Jennie.
Hi, Tiago.
We have the opportunity to be together all over this week. And I was wondering if I can ask you an advice, not address you a question, because you have a background on hospitality studies. And we know that hospitality can be so focused on industry, on hands-on things, on service providing, but also on this humanistic, philosophical, anthropological approach to hospitality. And this could be more or less the same to tourism, maybe. So we can look at tourism as a service sector where you can put together, you know, several kinds of services to provide the tourist something nice. But we can look at tourism in a more complex way, like this, for instance. And mobilities comes to help us in a way, to broaden a little bit how we frame tourism, not only as activity, but also as a, you know, a more complex way to frame the world in a way. And the advice I would like to ask you, how can we combine or balance these two approaches on tourism schools? Because we are here in a tourism school too. We have lots of influences, of course, but we are training people on tourism all over the country. And one of our challenges is to, you know, inspire them and inspire us to look at tourism in a more complex way. But at the same time, students are looking for their position in the world, in the market, in a professional career. So do you have any advice on that?
No, do you? Because this is exactly something, no, this is exactly something I have been trying to do in different corners of my career. So for example, we launched the journal Hospitality and Society. The dream is that the social sciences and the humanities and historians who are working in sort of critical hospitality theory are going to be in conversation with the people working in the hospitality industry, hospitality marketing, hospitality education, right? Training people to work in the hospitality industry. And our journal will be this beautiful place where we have these conversations. And instead, what actually happens, except in some cases that we have really worked really hard to create, but mostly what happens is you get the journal and article number 1 is like theoretical, philosophical. Article number 2, how to increase word of mouth for your hotel. Article number 3, you know, hospitality discourse around immigration. But there's no, like what you're looking for, right? How do we actually have a conversation and not just be talking at each other like this? I really don't know. I know that when I was at the University of Lapland, one of the ways that they addressed this is that a lot of the people who were doing critical hospitality and tourism work were located in political science or sociology, but they also have a practicum, and the students run a hotel and restaurant. And that becomes a laboratory for the sociologists as well. And so they have a little bit more exchange in that scenario. But it's logistically very difficult to do, I think. Maybe Dan has the answer.
Oh, no sé si falar portugués, portuñol, español, inglés. Sorry. The first question I want to make you is about, every time I think about tourism, I cannot stop in thinking about commodification and capitalism. So what about the commodification of future? You know, the future is a new commodity. On the other hand, I cannot stop thinking about João's presentation about academic extractivism. You know, you love to bring non-Western, non-university thoughts, you know, bringing Afro-American, indigenous, blah, 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 into the academy, but we don't never open our doors to be more collaborative and to have, you know, a more collaborative knowledge, a production of knowledge. So this is something that I found, you know, studying tourism 20 years ago, you know, people bringing food from the last region of Chile, or, you know, the tango, candombe, blah, blah, blah. And we use it as the content for our papers, for our theses, for our career, which is the very progressive line of past, present, and future, you know, talking about other temporalities. So I wonder how we change our way in which we produce knowledge about tourism, new kind of industry, or whatever you want to call it, you know. How will you create another kind of universities as well, you know, accessibility to other voices, or another kind of collaboration. I imagine the museum Rocinha could be a place where we meet and encounter, you know, because I think the good thing of tourism is about encounters. So how is the new strategy, you know, to avoid this kind of academic extractivism?
Do you want to translate his question? Should we have translated Tiago's question? Oh, do you want to answer? Do you want to answer, Dan? You have something to say? Okay. Gracias por la pregunta en inglés. Seriously, right? I mean, like English is like the main way that people are hospitable to me because I can participate. But okay, commodification of the future, yes, right? And this is part of why John Urry is like, hey, social scientists, don't leave the future to the corporations and the military, and because they are creating this open, empty future that they can commodify and colonize, just the way they created this imagined, like, oh, Australia is just empty, or the American Southwest is empty, so we can just commodify and colonize it. It's like the same impulse. So I agree completely about how the future is commodified. And this thing that is happening in Saudi Arabia, I don't think it's actually happening, but it's the imaginary of Neom and this, y'all have to like Google it because I can't explain it. The city of the future is completely about commodifying the future. But I mean, your point about academic mobility is incredibly important. I know we were talking about the culture of journals being inhospitable to submissions by, you know, non-native English-speaking scholars. My journal, the Hospitality and Society, we actively were recruiting, trying to get scholarship from non-native English-speaking scholars, and helping to translate or to you know, whatever. But still, we publish everything in English, although we talked about publishing in other languages too, but the publisher was like, I don't think we can do that, right? So there are all these like logistical and structural obstacles to that. Similarly with the global mobility. So I'm a member of the AAG, the Association of American Geographers, which always holds its meeting in North America. And often we have colleagues who cannot come because they cannot get the visas. And of course, it's very, very expensive for them. And we want them to be there, and logistically, we have these mobility regimes that are also in the way of the academic hospitality and the academic mobility. But we ourselves, as scholars, shouldn't be part of the obstacle. And sometimes we are, I think, if that makes sense. So, yes, and sorry.
Obrigado pela questão, Dan. Eu acho que se te provocou, é um bom sinal. Eu acho que é a provocação que faz a gente tentar pensar de forma diferente e pensar em novas possibilidades, né? Você começou com a pergunta para a Jennie, falando sobre comodificação do futuro e de que forma trazer esses referenciais culturais não-western também não é uma comodificação do exótico, do que é diferente. Eu acho que o caminho e o movimento é outro. Na verdade, como... Eu acho que a própria agora não sei se foi a Jennie ou a Mimi que propôs pensar isso no debate do olhar do turista 3.0, que é deixar de ser exótico, né? Desexotizar o turismo e, por consequente, também esses referenciais. Eu tive a a oportunidade de estar aqui numa sala de aula da UNIRIO, a convite da professora Thaís Costa, e eu fiquei muito contente com a turma que eu encontrei. É uma turma muito diferente da que eu fazia parte quando estudante, não aqui, mas na Federal Fluminense, há 16 anos atrás. Na ocasião, era uma turma na minha ocasião, era uma turma majoritariamente branca, dentro da chave colorista brasileira, né, porque se a gente for para outro lugar, os brancos deixam de ser brancos. Mas a gente sabia que tinha ali uma questão elitista e classista naquele momento. E acho que isso tende a ser transformado com as políticas afirmativas, as políticas de cotas aqui na brasileira, políticas de cotas brasileiras. Eu acho que, aí a sua pergunta foi, como produzir uma outra universidade, como produzir outro conhecimento? Definitivamente não é só trazendo esses referenciais, é trazendo essas pessoas. Produzir outras pessoas, produzir outra universidade significa fazer uma universidade com outras pessoas. E aqui a questão da representatividade não é mero preciosismo estético de ter uma foto com colorida, mas é ter uma universidade melhor. No momento que a gente tem pessoas que percorreram caminhos diferentes para chegar até aquele lugar, a gente tem ali outras vozes, outros sonhos, outras histórias, outros referenciais. E eu acho que eu respondo a sua pergunta também, e aí penso, a sua pergunta não é o que fazer, mas como fazer. Eu acho que a experiência que eu tive com o professor Tiago, quando ele me supervisionou no pós-doutorado lá na USP, aponta um caminho para isso, que é não pesquisar essas pessoas, as pessoas que a gente acha interessante, diferente de nós mesmos, mas pesquisar com elas, que elas façam parte da produção dessa narrativa, que elas se engajem nesse processo de contar essa própria história, que elas vislumbrem outras possibilidades de futuro, que diferentes talvez daquelas as que estão habituadas a fazer ou condenadas, pensando numa lógica de futuro pré-determinado, né? Eu acho que é uma provocação para a gente mesmo, sabe? Mas eu particularmente não vejo como fazermos uma outra universidade se continuarmos aludindo a esses referenciais eurocentrados. Eu acho que a gente precisa buscar outras referências, buscar outras ideias, e da mesma forma que, tendo pessoas diferentes, produziríamos uma universidade diferente, eu acredito que, tendo outros referenciais, a tendência é que tenhamos uma produção diferente do que é que concebemos. Muito bom, valeu.
Vou tomar a liberdade de só fazer uma parte na fala do João, quase que em defesa do Memória, né? Assim, não em defesa, mas explicando um pouco da onde que a gente fala, né? O João trouxe, debatendo a pesquisa que ele vai desenvolver, né, que ele está desenvolvendo no programa de pós-graduação em Memória Social, que é um programa que, na UNIRIO, né, aqui nesta universidade, ele é o programa que foi o primeiro a implementar a política de cotas a nível de pós-graduação, antes de vir via de regra, né, antes de ser obrigado a fazer, ele já fazia. Mas, independente da política de cotas, né, a gente tem um ingresso regular de estudantes, tanto no nível de mestrado quanto doutorado, que são sacerdotes de religiões de matriz afrodescendente, mestres de capoeira, né, o mestre Paulão, não sei se ele está assistindo, mas é um dos recentes doutorandos que nós temos, né, que é mestre de capoeira e é doutorando no programa, o Firmino, que vai nos guiar, né, vai nos levar na visita à Rocinha, ele é um acabou de ingressar no mestrado, não entrou como cotista. O mestre Paulão também não entrou como cotista, diga-se de passagem, né, eles poderiam ter se candidatado como tal, mas entraram na ampla concorrência. E a proposta é justamente essa, né, que esses ingressantes, esses grupos, esses estudantes, quando ingressam a nível, na pós-graduação, né, é justamente para a gente tentar fazer essa pesquisa, que não é nem pesquisar com, assim, né, não é nem o pesquisar com, mas é o pesquisar com, mas é com eles, de fato, liderando a pesquisa, né? Nós, como orientadores, colaboradores, mas quem está liderando a pesquisa, né, são os doutores da favela, que a Lícia Valadares, né, estudava lá, né, lá atrás, né? Estou dando o exemplo da favela em cima do Firmino, né? Mas, enfim, são esses doutores que a gente está com objetivo, com meta, assim mesmo, assim, de formar. Né? Então, eu acho que quando a Mimi... Acho que na última escola, a última escola foi sobre métodos, né? E acho que a Mimi fez uma palestra logo antes da escola de 2000 a escola que foi online, né? A escola de 2021. Aí, acho que foi uma fala no PPG Tour, lá da USP. Né? E uma pergunta que foi feita, se eu não me engano, foi Bianca, né? Foi isso. Bom, mobilidades justas, né? Justiça de mobilidade, mobilidades justas. Bom, e que métodos são os métodos, né? Para essa mobilidade? Né? E eu acho que passa um pouco por isso. Né? Não é só atravessar mais uma fronteira que não é o pesquisar com. É uma outra fronteira que aqui no Brasil a gente está assim, a passos muito lentos, né? Assim, há alguns anos a passos muito lentos, mas trabalhando nessa direção. Isso eu tenho certeza, né? Acho que e a perspectiva que nós temos para os próximos anos é que essas fronteiras, esses passos se acelerem um pouco, né? Essa é a proposta. Mas só assim essa pequena parte. Gente, mais alguma pergunta? Esqueci que eu era mediadora. Vesti a camisa de coordenadora por um instante. Então, bom, se não tivermos mais perguntas, podemos, né, fazer um intervalo para o almoço. Podemos conversar também no café, enfim, né, ainda com Jennie. Quem tiver mais tímido, quiser fazer uma pergunta mais no café, né, temos um café ali fora também. Fiquem à vontade. Tá? Agradeço muito a presença nessa manhã meio chuvosa no Rio de Janeiro. Sabemos as dificuldades de deslocamento, muitas vezes. E quem está assistindo também a transmissão online, agradecemos a participação. Aí eu não vi se tinha pergunta online, mas, se tiver, a gente pode depois até passar algumas perguntas para a Jennie e tentar, né, pegar esse material.
Uma informação importante agora, antes de encerrar, quem desejar indicação de locais para refeição, consultem na secretaria do evento, na antessala do auditório. É isso, gente. Bom almoço e até breve. A gente retorna 2h30.